My obsession with Netburst is one that I can't quite explain. Maybe it's because I grew up with a Pentium 4 computer in the house. Maybe it's because the first computers I really got a chance to tinker with were Pentium 4s. Maybe even the fact that Pentium 4 and Pentium D systems have been nearly worthless for over a decade. Whatever the reason, I just can't seem to pull myself away from this extremely flawed architecture. However, there is one form of Netburst that is most certainly not worthless, one that is not easily obtainable, and one that offers the best performance that Intel's infamously long-stage pipeline has to offer. I've been chasing this setup for years, slowly piecing together everything I would need and investing much to achieve it. After tracking down the final pieces, I think I'm finally ready.
Fire. Fire.
What we have here today is very special, to me at least. 4 cores and 8 threads of 3.73 GHz Netburst Xeon goodness. Well, goodness may be a bit of a stretch, but the setup is impressive nonetheless. But before we get too in-depth on this dual-socket beauty, we need to briefly go over the Pentium 4, Pentium D, and Xeon in order to get a good idea of what we have going on here. And before you ask, because I know some people are already thinking it, and questioning the claim in the title, to my knowledge, a quad socket isn't possible, at least for these specific CPUs. Trust me, I looked at a lot of motherboards and I can't find any evidence, but I'll address this more later. While the Netburst story goes all the way back to 2000, we're only interested in a narrow window of time, towards the end of its life. In 2005, things weren't necessarily looking great for Intel's current lineup. Its third and final major design for Netburst, called Prescott, wasn't exactly doing great in a number of aspects. High power consumption, high heat output, clock speed goals weren't being reached, and nearly every CPU in the lineup, from the P4 to the Pentium D, was getting trounced by AMD's Athlon 64. Intel's savior in the form of Conroe, aka the Core 2 Duo architecture, wouldn't be coming out until mid-2006, so Intel was stuck with Netburst for now. During this time frame, however, Intel would release its fastest Netburst chips. The Pentium 4 670 would clock in at 3.8 GHz. This P4 has the distinction of having the highest internal clock speed of a Netburst CPU, beating out the Pentium D and Xeon lineup. This, however, was an extremely small lead of like a few megahertz, and didn't amount to much given differences in frontside bus speed between them. Intel had a 4 GHz P4 in the pipeline, however they would just cancel it for being too impractical. The Pentium D is where things finally get more interesting. The Pentium D is obviously dual-core compared to the P4's offering of single-core and sometimes with hyperthreading. And while it wasn't necessarily a great dual-core design, it's what Intel had to work with at the time. It wasn't under the Pentium D branding, though, that Intel would release its best Netburst CPU. That honor goes to the Pentium Extreme Edition 965. For all intents and purposes, this is a Pentium D, and sometimes people erroneously include the D in the model number, but the official name is just Pentium Extreme Edition 965. The 965 is special from other Pentium Ds. Being an Extreme Edition, it of course has an unlocked multiplier for getting better overclocking results. However, it has the key advantage of being clocked at 3.73 GHz out of the box, and due to its higher front side bus speed compared to the P4 670, also means it's on par with the fastest P4, if not slightly faster in single-thread workloads. Its other key distinguishing feature is that it's shipped with hyperthreading, giving it a total of 2 cores and 4 threads. This by far makes it the best single Netburst CPU. The overclocking potential coupled with the high thread count has made it very desirable amongst overclocking record hunters and, let's be honest, Intel fanboys. Releasing in early 2006 for $999, it made it a pretty miserable value given Conroe was just months away. But this was Intel giving a nice farewell to Netburst after having stuck with the architecture for the past 5 years. Unfortunately, we do not have a Pentium 965 here today. I recommend you go watch Fully Buffered's excellent video on the chip if you're curious, and the Pentium 965 can't be used in a multi-socket setup. At least not officially. I'm sure with enough shenanigans anything is possible. So the 965 is the ultimate Netburst setup if you overclock it and only care about like gaming and other single thread heavy applications. But we can go even better, because why have just one when you can have 2 of them? These are a pair of Xeon 5080s. For all intents and purposes, these are identical to the Pentium 965. There are a couple key differences though. One, it can't overclock via the multiplier. It's locked down just like most other Intel CPUs are. Overclocking these might be possible if you have the right motherboard, but it's not going to be very simple because this isn't a consumer platform. And given that this is an enterprise platform, we also get our second distinction of a new socket. That socket being LGA 771, and it brings with it multi-socket support. You may have noticed that I said new socket. That's right, because the Xeon 5080 actually launched LGA 771 and was among the first chips available for the platform. That's another curiosity about these particular Xeons, which are codenamed Dempsey, and I will be referring to them often as such from here on out. Most people who do know about these Netburst Xeons often only know about the fastest one, the 5080. However, Intel actually had a whole lineup of these Netburst Xeons available at the launch of 771, ranging from the 5020 to the 5080. Intel apparently had all of these. I'm not sure if all of these actually exist in any real quantity, to be honest, as I've only seen a few of the mid-range ones on sale on eBay, and something about them just seems to either scream extremely limited release to me, or that they never really made it past the sampling phase. These CPUs being used to launch LGA 771 is odd to me, considering the timing. I'll touch on this in the second half of the video where I explain why these Xeons make almost no sense, but I'm sure now that you guys want to actually see the system in action and what you can do with 4 cores of Netburst power. Of course, we need to discuss the motherboard. Now, I could have sworn that I had seen quad-socket LGA 771 boards in the past, but upon researching for this video, I can't seem to actually find any. And if they even do exist, I have a hunch that they probably wouldn't even bother supporting these Netburst CPUs. So to my knowledge, at least, dual socket is the best we can go for on LGA 771. While doing research, I discovered that there were actually quad socket 604 motherboards. Socket 604 is the Xeon socket that predated 771, and to my surprise, Intel did actually release a dual-core processor for 604. So in theory, 8 cores might actually be possible for Netburst. The CPUs don't actually seem to be all that expensive. The motherboards, though, however, are not, and who knows if the quad-socket boards even support this dual-core chip. Not to mention that this CPU is only clocked at 2.8 GHz, so that is significantly slower than the 5080. If someone out there really wants to try this out, more power to them. As for me, I think I'll just stick with this for now, but the knowledge that 8 cores might be possible is really going to bother me now. It's worth mentioning as well that there are Xeon 7100 CPUs. These are also Netburst based and are part of the Xeon MP line. These don't clock as high as the 5000s, but they did come with an obscene amount of cache. I doubt those would really be much faster than a 5080, also considering the slower FSB, but I figured it'd be worth noting that these also exist. The motherboard I bought for this was actually made by Intel themselves. This is the Intel S5000 PSL, and Intel officially lists the Dempseys as being compatible, and I actually bought this brand new. That's right, there's a guy on eBay who has, for some reason, a ton of these as new old stock, so even if you aren't interested in doing the whole dual socket Netburst thing like I did, and you just want to mess around with some Core 2 era stuff, maybe pick one of these up. The price is pretty reasonable too, and you don't have to worry about trying to find all the accessories to go with the board. The amount of I/O this board offers is excellent. It has 2 PCI Express by 16 slots, though according to the reference card, these are only wired up for by 8, which kinda sucks. There are 2 by 8 slots, which are only wired up for by 4. Okay, maybe it's not as impressive as I thought. 2 64-bit PCI X slots, 6 SATA ports with 4 of them being capable of being SAS ports, and it even has built-in video, which is actually provided by an ATI chip, though I'm not really trusting this chip to be able to do much of anything useful, so I've opted to put an RX 480 in here, which should be more than fast enough for what the system is capable of. For the boot drive, I'm using a 120 gig SSD paired with a 240 gig SSD, because I was stupid and underestimated how much stuff I was going to have to install. The system requires DDR2 fully buffered DIMMs, and all I have available is 8 gigs. 8 gigs is certainly not bad considering the era of this system, but it's not ideal for modern stuff. Though I don't think this is a huge issue in practice since we're largely going to be running slightly older stuff on here, and I don't really want to have to spend any more money on this system. Even though these Dempsey chips are actually 65 nanometer and thus aren't nearly as bad as they could be, they still definitely need some good cooling and power delivery. These heat sinks are just some random super micro ones that I found on eBay. They have heat pipes and a copper base plate and seem to do a good enough job with these 80mm fans hot glued to the top of them. For whatever reason, no utilities seem to actually be able to read the temp sensors in these chips, so it's anyone's guess if they're getting too hot or not. While the 850 watt power supply is a little bit overkill, it isn't by that much. This system running at full load can pull upwards of 400 watts and is thus a pretty decent space heater. What OS to use wasn't an easy choice. Since in this video I aim to look at what the system can do in a more modern context, we need a more modern OS than say XP or Vista to really be able to get the most out of the system. I would love to use Windows 7, however getting modern software, especially games working at this point, is more hassle than it's probably worth, so that pretty much narrows it down between Windows 10 and Linux. Now with Linux, it honestly didn't feel all that much better than Windows 10 to be honest. I tried it with Fedora running Mate, but I didn't really feel like it was significantly faster, not to mention gaming was a nightmare on it. I did eventually get Doom to run after it taking forever to compile the Vulkan shaders, but the performance was just slightly better on Windows. Not surprising since most of the games I want to run would require Proton, which is just going to eat up precious resources. Also, some games didn't want to launch at all, so I just decided to go with Windows 10 LTSC for all the testing to make things simple. I've disabled telemetry, I've removed Edge, and the fact that it's LTSC leaves us with a Windows environment that shouldn't be that much heavier than, say, a fully updated copy of Windows 7. I know it's not ideal, but it's just what I'm going with. So what is using the system actually like? Well, the Windows install is really nothing of note. It already has all the drivers you need, but I did go ahead and update the Radeon driver just to be safe. First impressions are honestly pretty decent. It feels a lot like running Windows 10 on maybe a 10 to 12-year-old pretty mediocre system. I wouldn't describe it as snappy by any means, but certainly usable. The first sign, however, that things are not so fast is when you install updates. Windows updates can sometimes take upwards of 20 minutes to download and fully install, but that's not the end of the world, I suppose. Now for web browsing. I'm going to be using Brave since that's just what I'm the most used to be honest. Simpler pages prove really no challenge at all. Google feels fast, eBay is surprisingly snappy with even the enlarged image preview being very smooth. Amazon wasn't quite as fast as eBay, but still very usable. A normal Pentium 4 or D would be struggling a lot here, so seeing this is nice. But the big test I know we all want to see, how does it handle YouTube? Now you might assume that since we have a very modern GPU that we're kind of cheating here and aren't going to be seeing how well the CPUs actually perform, since the GPU's video decoding should be taking over. However, even if GPU utilization is being used here, which I suspect it isn't, the performance is still very disappointing. It can handle 720p just fine, and it can even just manage to scrape by with 1080p without any major frame drops. But if we bump things up to 60 FPS, it really starts to fall apart. 720p 60 is watchable, but there are quite a few frame drops here and there, so don't expect it to be smooth consistently. And 1080p 60 is pretty bad with constant frame drops. I really expected the system to do better than this with YouTube, to be honest, but it really seems like this site every year just gets harder to run for no real reason. You might be able to improve your playback by using an extension like H.264 but I don't think it would be a huge improvement aside from maybe allowing older GPUs to pitch in. Actually browsing around on the YouTube homepage and whatnot wasn't too bad though, at least, so I guess the system's got that going for it. For the next test, I decided to get a little ambitious and decided to try editing video in DaVinci Resolve. Yes, I am using the latest version, just to be extra cruel to it. The RX 480 is definitely doing a lot of heavy lifting here. A more period-accurate GPU would probably make the experience pretty terrible, but honestly, other than taking a long time to import the clips, it actually wasn't too bad. It was not smooth by any means, but you could actually scrub around in the timeline without it taking 5 years to catch up, so that is pretty impressive given the hardware we're working with here. And this was using 1080p 60 FPS footage at 28 megabits per second. You could probably improve the performance quite a bit by letting Resolve generate proxy clips, but that takes up a huge amount of storage space and would take a long time too, so it's probably not even worth trying, to be honest. I edited together a simple 1-minute test clip using some old footage from another video of mine, and also threw in some cross-dissolve transitions just to, add a little bit of extra work for it to do. The render time is not impressive. Resolve doesn't seem to make heavy use of the GPU during encodes from what I've experienced, and that seems to be true here too. It took about 2.5 minutes to render out this 1-minute clip. Same frame rate and resolution as the source clips, but I did bump it down to render out at only 13 megabits per second. I was honestly expecting it to be a little worse than this, but that's still not great, to be honest. Time to bust out everyone's favorite, Cinebench. Starting with R15, since this is the only version that I have a sense of what a good score is actually off the top of my head, we can see that things are, well, I can't say I'm surprised. 220 for the multi-core isn't bad, and that's actually in like Core 2 quad territory, so pretty impressive. The single thread score is, well, 42. Honestly, not surprising at all since that's what a Pentium 4 can usually do in this benchmark, but having such low single-threaded performance is definitely not going to help us in gaming. And R20 just makes things look even worse. As far as a Netburst system goes, this is pretty impressive so far. Of course though, we want to see what it can pull off in gaming. I decided to start things off with an easy one, that being Sonic Mania. Considering that this game ran perfectly on a 3.6 GHz Pentium 4 back when I used a Pentium 4 for an entire month, go check out that video, I guess I shouldn't be surprised that it runs perfectly here as well. The modern Steam version of Half-Life 2 has seen many updates over the past 20 years and is now significantly more demanding than it was originally. At 1080p high, the average FPS isn't bad, and the game feels pretty decent to play, other than the massive stutters that occasionally happen. Downgrading to the old engine version of Half-Life 2 would probably be the way to go for playing on this system. Going for a more high-end source game, we have Black Mesa. At 1080p low, the game isn't running very well at all. It's hovering between the mid-20s and 30 FPS most of the time, though we have stuttering throughout. The game also just does not feel good to play. There's some serious input lag going on here and is making the game a lot harder to play than it otherwise would. I'm not too surprised by the game not running well, but I was at least hoping the input lag wouldn't be this bad. Doom 2016 is by far the game I wanted to check out the most on here. When using the Vulkan renderer, the game can almost always use every single thread a CPU has to offer. This makes older systems that have a high core count but low single-thread performance usually very playable with this game. After quite a lengthy load time, which is gonna become a reoccurring thing for pretty much every game going forward, I set it up to 1080p low settings, although I did leave anti-aliasing cranked since that should only be putting load on the GPU. Don't worry, I did double check just to make sure and there was no difference. The performance is, well, definitely not what you'd want for playing a fast-paced shooter like Doom, but nonetheless impressive. It was getting around 40-ish FPS on average, though it would drop to the 20s at times, and there was a fair amount of stuttering here and there. Still, the fact that a Netburst system is running this game at all, let alone this well, is seriously impressive. It's not a great experience by any means, but just getting to see Doom running on here made the whole project worth it in my eyes. BeamNG is the newest game I'm going to test. Well, newest at least in the sense that it's still being actively updated and improved upon regularly. I did try to use the Vulkan renderer, however it would just give an error and not launch. I guess they weren't lying when they said that it was the unstable renderer. So using the DX11 renderer at 1080p lowest settings, well, after waiting 3 business days for the map to actually load, things aren't great. It's getting single-digit frame rates on the test track, and let's just say controlling a car at 7 FPS is one of the most frustrating things you can ever deal with in a racing game. Going to some simpler maps like the Island Cliff map, the frame rate could go up to a whopping 15. I'm surprised the game just didn't crash on this system, but needless to say, this game just isn't playable. I did try to see if I could get Battlefield 1 to run, but I'm thinking our CPUs are just missing extensions. These have even less than what the Core 2s have, so this is kind of expected. I figured, just for the fun of it, to try out the Crash Insane trilogy. At 1080p low, to my surprise, the game actually managed a pretty consistent 30 FPS. I know this game isn't the most demanding, but I didn't expect it to run this well. At least the frame rate is on par with the PS1 original. Persona 4 Golden is another pretty lightweight title, but I wanted to check it out since I was able to run it back in 2022 on the Pentium 4, albeit it liked to crash a lot. Since then, the game has been updated and now requires 64-bit. The settings didn't seem to really matter here, but it would get between 40 to 60 FPS. Considering that this is a Vita game, which itself is a PS2 port, I kind of expected it to do better than this. It is an RPG though, so it's perfectly playable, but I was just hoping for at least a little bit more. The game didn't seem to crash though like it did in the past, so that's a nice improvement. And there you have it. That's what 4 cores and 8 threads of Intel's finest, overly long pipeline has to offer. But this brings us to an important discussion. Remember how I said that these Dempsey Xeons launched LGA 771? Well, that happened roughly in May of 2006. Wikipedia says it was May 23rd, and other articles seem to indicate that that's when the CPUs were at least unveiled or near that day, so we're just going to roll with it since it's likely system integrators already started shipping them right after that date. However, like right after the launch. In fact, this CNET article claims it was the same day Intel showed off benchmarks of their new Woodcrest Xeons. Woodcrest is using the same core design as the Core 2 Duo, and I just have to wonder why Intel would even do this. This seems like just sabotaging yourself for no real reason. Why on earth would you show off your next product on the day you're trying to convince people to buy your objectively worse architecture? To make matters worse, AnonTech would get hands-on with a Woodcrest system in early June, and their full review of Woodcrest would come out in mid-July. So I think we can plant the Woodcrest launch around here. Wikipedia says June 26 was the release date, but it's not cited, so we can't rely on that. That's, what, a month and a half? 2 months at best, and Intel's already replacing Dempsey with a new architecture? Why did they even bother releasing this thing then? Well, I have a couple theories. The Woodcrest Xeons didn't have hyperthreading, so maybe if you needed as high of a thread count as possible, maybe Dempsey would make more sense. It's worth noting Intel would release quad-core Xeons in early 2007, so this would be a pretty short-sighted decision to invest in, unless you needed a system deployed ASAP. Though I don't really know of a situation where virtual threads would really be super useful. Maybe virtual machines? I'm not familiar enough with VMs, especially not on a corporate level, to really say if this is a valid use case. Another reason might be is that if you as an enterprise had invested heavily into software, possibly custom written software that was heavily optimized for Netburst, Intel may have wanted to give these customers one final platform with more modern features and give them Netburst as an option. But that's really it. I can't think of any other reason why Intel wouldn't have just waited 2 months to launch the platform with Woodcrest instead. Maybe they were desperate to put something out to compete with AMD's Opteron, which had been besting them for quite a while at this point. Or maybe they had already invested all the time and money and effort into Dempsey and just decided, screw it, we'll just release it anyways, I guess. Of course, I'm not just going to sit here and tease you with the supposedly vastly superior Woodcrest architecture. So what I have here are two Xeon 5140s. These are not even the top tier Woodcrests that were available at launch. The top tier ones ran at 3 GHz. These only run at 2.33. I chose these ones specifically because they're about half the price of Intel's suggested price for the 5080. So we can see just how bad of a value Dempsey really was. The first thing I noticed right off the bat was that the whole system just felt a little snappier. It felt like things in Windows just didn't take quite as long. Web browsing was already pretty decent on Dempsey, but the 5140s are just a little bit better. YouTube doesn't see a huge improvement though. 1080p 60 still sees a lot of frame drops, and we can see that all the threads are still being maxed out as well. Scrubbing the timeline and resolve feels a bit smoother, and the render time for the same project was just 2 minutes 18 seconds. A 20-second improvement may not seem massive, but over the course of a longer render, that time would really add up. Gaming as a whole is vastly better. Persona 4 is now a buttery 60 FPS, Crash Bandicoot is sticking pretty close to 60 FPS with the occasional drop, BeamNG is vastly better with Woodcrest getting high teens and low 20s on the test track, with the cliff map getting well over 30. Not to mention that the cars actually feel somewhat drivable now. Black Mesa, okay, it still kind of sucks to be honest, but I'd say the frame rate is maybe a tad higher. The input lag felt like it was a little bit better though. And Doom was downright beautiful in comparison, often exceeding 60 FPS, usually staying in the 50s, with the odd drop to about 40 FPS. It just felt way more fluid in general. And finally, in Cinebench R15, despite having more threads than Woodcrest, Dempsey loses the multi-thread test by a slight bit and gets demolished in the single thread. They're almost even in R20 multi-thread, but Woodcrest is still dominating in single thread. And the final nail in the coffin for Dempsey, the power consumption. At idle, Woodcrest is using about 124 watts, I went with a rough average here, and Dempsey is using an astonishing 197 watts at idle. With a full multi-core load in Cinebench R20, for this one I grabbed the highest number that I saw on the meter, Dempsey pulls a room-heating 393 watts. Woodcrest, just 188 watts. Bear in mind that these are both built on a 65nm process, so this is pretty much just down to a difference in architectural efficiency. Ouch. Hey, editing NTG here. I noticed while editing, my Xeon 5140s are actually the later G0 stepping, which according to ARC run at a slightly lower voltage than the original B2 stepping does. I don't think this really changes the power consumption results that much, but it is probably making Woodcrest look slightly better than it would have at launch. So just bear that in mind. The original B2s probably consumed, who knows how many extra watts, maybe 20, maybe-ish extra watts. I don't really know. It's kind of hard to say without having them. but I don't think it really changes the results that much. Netburst was still ridiculous. Like, they're both still on the 65 nanometer process, and the difference is still probably pretty huge between them. So, yeah, Netburst was not good. And there you have it, Intel's Netburst offering, replacing just a couple months with this and consuming enough power to put a 4090 to shame. Can't say I really expected much else from Netburst, to be honest. Obviously, this is a dumb and impractical system, and you should not build one. So hopefully this serves as a good demonstration of what these chips could do. I've had the dream of doing this video for probably 4+ years at this point, and I've spent the better part of 5 months gathering all the parts and testing it out. I hope as I stream my production pipeline to be able to produce more higher quality videos like this, but don't worry, there'll still be plenty of unscripted videos here and there on the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. I've done several other videos with various Pentium 4s, and you could probably tell I'm maybe a bit of a fan of the platform, even though it objectively sucks. So if you want to watch those other Pentium 4 videos, you can go ahead and check them out if you want. And again, if you want to see the Pentium Extreme Edition version of this chip and want to see it overclocked, go check out Fully Buffered's video or one of the other videos on the 965. There's plenty out there, and they're all pretty good watch in my opinion. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.